Right, good evening. Welcome back. I've requested recently of some of you for submissions on what to speak here in the reignition of the YouTube self-documentation series, and I've received some submissions, a good handful. Thank you. Um, Again, in turn, a good handful of those submissions I really liked, and I will get to. Sadly, not all of them. And in the spirit of ambition and high aspirations, I figured it would be best if I spoke on the most difficult of submissions, at least by my estimation, which was submitted by Carl. Thank you, Carl. So, in today's conversation, I'm going to share my thoughts on love, which is very broadly put, and it's a huge topic. I wanted to release this video about a week ago, but I had issues both with the recording of this video and in my private life, and other things became paramount to this, at least momentarily. But we're back. We're going to try. So, love. I think in speaking on love, one of the biggest fallacies one should avoid is too quickly using buzzwords or buzz sentences, phrases such as love is all encompassing, love is all powerful, love is everywhere. It means nothing, and at the same time, it means everything. It's very ethereal and, well, non-descriptive. So instead, I'm going to try to use descriptive language, and in doing so, I'm going to try to share a story, real life events, and then circle back to how I conclude that to be love. Because I think love is quickly tackled is perhaps aggressive language, but love is quickly tackled through the lens of romance, which is fine. But romance is often viewed too narrowly. Romance doesn't particularly have to be as simple as, in my particular case, the love for a woman. Romance, I think, can be found in great writing, great film, gestures, smells, behaviors. And so, what best to speak on than, at least by my estimation, some of the most impressive men that I've listened to in my life. So, let me begin this way. In 1992, an actor called Sidney Poitier, a black actor, received the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award for his contribution to the world of cinema and the forward bringing of American film culture. That's essentially what you receive the AFI for, your contribution over the span of a lifetime, usually to film. When receiving this award, Sidney Poitier, rightfully so, received a lot of praise. As with these events, you hear in the position of Sidney Poitier in this particular instance a lot of speeches about you from friends, from colleagues, from relatives. People take the stage and they tell stories and they tell tales and they speak on your character and your life. And the life of Sidney Poitier, as one can perhaps imagine, was ridden with hardship and inequality. As a black man, to occupy the entertainment industry the way he did, he He won an Oscar back in 1964, I believe. And if you know anything about race relations in America, 1964 was not a particularly ideal time to be black. The man was impressive, to say the least. When dedicating himself to film, Sidney Poitier set out to make movies that essentially spoke of only the dignity, the nobility, and the magnificence of human life. And I think, in essence, that is what film is best at. In fact, I would go so far as to say that nothing is as good as film when it comes to depicting the dignity, the nobility, and the magnificence of human life. Anyhow, that was his motto, that was his aspiration, that was his standard. In doing so, Sidney Poitier has inspired many, many men. He was a very literate man. He had an extreme presence, especially upon stage. Perfect speech, which I value immensely, given the fact that I'm doing this self-documentation series for reasons of bettering my speech, amongst other things. And before he took the stage that night to thank everyone who had spoken, one of the many young black actors whom he inspired spoke in order to give thanks to Mr. Poitier. This young actor was none other than Mr. Morgan Freeman, who we now recognize as, well, Morgan Freeman, God. At the time, Morgan Freeman was already recognized as an immense star in the world of show business. And say what you like about Hollywood, but Hollywood is probably, arguably, the most competitive field of competence to want to inhabit. Adding to that, the fact that Mr. Morgan Freeman was black, which certainly didn't make it much easier for him to inhabit that field of competence to the degree that he did back then and he does today is impressive, to say the least. Anyhow, a young Morgan Freeman is announced, and instead of taking stage, he stands from his table and he gave a very short speech. His name is called, and he rises. He's wearing a tuxedo with a small bow tie, and around his neck, on a small string, his glasses hung approximately at the level of his sternum, I think. And he rises and he pulls out of the right-hand pocket of his tuxedo, of his jacket, a piece of paper. And as he takes this piece of paper out of his jacket, he initiates eye contact with Mr. Poitier. And for the duration of his speech, with the exception of putting the paper back down shortly, he kept that gaze uninterrupted. He holds the piece of paper. Right, excuse me. He holds the piece of paper like this, and he says, I have it actually, hold on. I wrote it down because I was taking notes. Yes, there it is. So he raises the piece of paper, and again, this is supposed to give thanks to Mr. Poitier. And he says, when I knew I was coming here, I sat down and wrote all this on paper. But I can't stand here and read from a paper and talk to you. Here he puts the paper back down on the table, I believe, turns briefly, turns back, and immediately, the intense gaze, only him and Mr. Poitier, in a room full of people, gaze. He continues, every man has his own heaven. And for me, heaven has always been being in the movies. And always in my heaven, since I first started thinking about it, I've had one bright light. Sidney Poitier, I do thank you. And he sits back down. Now, the reason I mention this is because for anyone interested who would like to go back and listen to that short speech by Morgan Freeman, two things are particularly telling with this short speech. One, that gaze, to signify that these words are in fact being spoken to Mr. Poitier instead of being shared to some degree at least as a performative act. Secondly, the last sentence of that speech is crucial to hear from Mr. Freeman himself. Because as he says the words, I do thank you, his hands raised like this, I believe, his voice breaks just a little bit, and it's such a subtle nuance that is telling of how much love, passion, devotion, power, and gratitude went into that short sentence, I do thank you. Because how else would you express immense gratitude to someone who has contributed to your life so immensely? Other than so simply. One of the rules of writing, as one learns, is, or I should say it this way, when you learn to write, you develop, first and foremost, a vocabulary, and because you've developed this vocabulary, usually in a short period of time, there is some sort of urgency and desire to communicate that new competence and this new skill through the writing. So writing can become quickly very wordy, at least that was the case with me. Now, my writing can still, to this day, remain very wordy, but I do that more so on purpose, if I do it. At least that's what I tell myself. However, over a long enough period of time, whenever you learn a skill, you acquire a skill, throughout the skill acquisition, rule of life begins to apply, which is less is more. Now, that sounds very, very simple, I understand. But oftentimes, you can distinguish between an individual who is saying less because he has not the capacity to say more, and an individual who's saying less because he has developed the capacity to say less. That is a very significant difference. And in this particular instance, with I do thank you, you can clearly tell this is an individual who could speak at length, for hours probably, about this sense of gratitude that he feels. And he has compressed all that into this short sentence, thereby almost choking when saying that line. Now, if you're interested, I do recommend you go back and you just type into YouTube, Morgan Freeman salutes Sidney Poitier. It's a 1-minute video. It's worth it. Anyhow, the story continues. You see, of the next generation, we could say, we were lucky enough to receive another extremely gifted, powerful, competent, and wise actor of black descent, Mr. Denzel Washington. Now, in 2008, at the 2008 Kennedy Honors, Mr. Morgan Freeman was being awarded a sort of recognition, I believe, again, for his contribution to acting. As a result of which, again, there was a large event, and Mr. Washington took stage to praise and acknowledge Mr. Freeman. Denzel takes the stage, and he tells a story of when he was a very young and unknown actor. He was in a play with Mr. Morgan Freeman. I think an off-Broadway production of Coriolanus. Anyhow, they had a scene in there. Morgan Freeman, already an established actor, Mr. Denzel Washington, young, aspiring, and hungry. And in said scene, the scene was essentially them having a very short sword fight. 3 clicks, Freeman stabs Washington, Washington falls over and dies. Mr. Washington, being the ambitious actor, the ambitious young man, I would also argue here distinctively that he was, he came to Mr. Morgan Freeman with the proposition of kind of expanding the scene. He told him, he introduced himself, and he said maybe we could extend the scene with some additional cutting and stabbing and wounding and such. In short, Mr. Freeman tells this young actor to take back his position, and when he comes out, they click swords 3 times. Mr. Freeman stabs him. He falls over and dies. Now, this is told in a very funny way, obviously, given the nature of the story. And it is exactly after the story has ended and Mr. Denzel Washington continues that the humor drops. And immediately, if you're watching the video, you can see the shift of tone that happens in body language and in language, in spoken language, very quickly. I will not speak for Mr. Washington to which degree Morgan Freeman has affected his life, inspired him to be who he's become. I would leave that for you to check out on your own on YouTube. Again, Kennedy Honors 2008, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman. You'll find the video. But you can see there very clearly in the speech, in the way Denzel Washington looks up towards Mr. Morgan Freeman. There is a unity, a connection, love there that has led to the becoming of Denzel Washington. What does this say? One could argue that this means that when in devotion to one's own life, ambitiously, rigorously, in dedicated fashion, your doing and being will result not only in all that you wish, but also it will result in the ignition, in it will I'll start again from the beginning. In pursuing your life ambitiously, in dedication, with perseverance, you will not only bring forth and about into this life everything that you wish and fight for, you will also nurture the manifestation of the same spirit in those who look up to you. Inspiration is something that just, it is so difficult to explain, but so far from trivial that it's almost painful. I think inspiration is not as commonly understood. Me watching, I will take for example Ned Brockman here. Me watching Ned Brockman and being inspired by Ned Brockman. That is what's happening on the surface. What is happening on a molecular, spiritual level is that I see embodied in the external world, in someone else, a capacity that lives within me, which is exactly why what this individual is doing is speaking to me. That is all. Now that can be for you. That could be for you an ultra endurance athlete, an actor, a writer, a policeman, a teacher, anything you so imagine, whatever that is. But I think the precondition to being inspired is to have within you the capacity for whatever it is you're inspired by. And so in this particular scenario, what is the essence of Morgan Freeman lived within Morgan Freeman before it was awoken. But most certainly, that process of awakening was nurtured, if not even brought about, by Mr. Sidney Poitier. And though certainly Mr. Sidney Poitier had a very similar effect on Denzel Washington, Sidney Poitier being essentially the first, it was Morgan Freeman, I would argue, heavily, that helped Denzel Washington in the exact same way Sidney Poitier helped Morgan Freeman. How this doesn't scream love to us all, I cannot fathom. Dedication, resulting in three generations of extremely, extremely meaningful, impactful, gifted, competent, illuminating actors. Now, one might say that acting, is almost a trivial matter, an overpaid occupation. And I'll tell you, you're just a stupid dimwit if that's what you believe. Acting as a discipline has been around for as long as human beings have been around. We have always enacted story, in whatever capacity. Now, I'm not making an argument for the fact that actors are overpaid. I'm not going to discuss the politics or the I'm lacking a word, the financial side of the occupation. What I am arguing is the reason why film is the most intimate of art forms is because what we are consuming is the depiction of other people's lives. Now, when done correctly, what an actor does is portray the inner truth of another human being. This is less so an important matter if what you're watching is the Power Rangers. But you go watch Schindler's List. You go watch Whiplash. Go watch Interstellar. Go watch Sophie's Choice. Go watch 12 Years a Slave. Watch these films and then you tell me that what we're talking about is some trivial, non-essential form of expression. So I bring back the point again. In dedication to a individual, a personal pursuit of individualism, as was the case with a certain Mr. Sidney Poitier, the result of his life has, although not only, obviously, been that a Morgan Freeman would go on for the rest of his life to dedicate all of his success to the contribution Mr. Sidney Poitier has made on his life, through simply being. And when you watch the speeches that were held at the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award held for Denzel Washington, you will see that Mr. Washington listens to every single speech with such intention and such precision. He listens with such precision because his face is shown. You can tell these are more than merely words, more than merely performances on a stage. It's love. It's genuine, soul-consuming love. Now, I have in my own life loved deeply. I have. My love has been abused, and I have abused love. I have done people wrong, and people have done me wrong as well. Such is the nature of the human condition. But if something lacks love, it is almost immediately visible. If a piece of writing lacks love, the language used is completely irrelevant. Even the orchestration of the language, completely irrelevant, regardless of how competently done it is. I've just recently written a letter to Ned Brockman, actually. Ned, if you're watching, I'm sending it out tomorrow. Should be with you soon. Anyway, it took me a while because the first thing I'd written for him was it was competently done and it was nice, but it lacked love. Modern architecture lacks love. You know, and writing, in essence, a big chunk of writing is the work of an architect. It's construction. You know, you bleed on paper, ideally first, and then you come back once the bleeding is stopped, and you orchestrate sentences, words. It's almost mathematical work. And well, a lot of things can be said about that letter. Negative or positive, I don't really care. But what cannot be disputed is that it contains love. That it most certainly does. Now, certainly, I think we are all at our best as a collective, as a one, when love is at the forefront of our ambitions, of our pursuits. But it can take shapes different than the conventional shapes we understand it to take. Kobe Bryant was probably the most ruthless competitor that sports has ever seen. But that ruthlessness was bred out of love. I was asked to speak on book recommendations and books that changed me, and I will in a separate video. But I would like to say, one of the books that changed me drastically was A Man's Search for Meaning, and I read it when I was working in Greece. And though it sounds cheesy to say, one of my key takeaways from that book was those who survived found it within them to hold on to love long enough, whatever form that love took in their minds and souls. Well, I think that's all for now. I don't know if there's anything missing. There's certainly a lot missing. Love is too big a topic to cover well. So if you take anything from this, I hope it's this. Do not take the manner in which you live your life lightly. Because if done with devotion, passion, persistence, perseverance, and dedication, what all that might result in is a legacy of people to whom you are not related, who, thanks to you, are inspired to pursue their lives in a similar manner. Therewith praising the dignity, the nobility, the magnificence of human life. Thanks for listening, if anyone's still here, and yeah, I'll I'll speak again tomorrow. Much love.